Hey everyone, Wayne Fox here. Well, it's Friday, November the 8th, and as typical, my addiction to the newest and the greatest Mac, I couldn't resist, but I have my new M4 Max MacBook Pro that just arrived today. A little different this year. This year I configured it to be a 2 terabyte model instead of a 4 terabyte model. The main reason is I'm going to move all my Lightroom libraries and my video libraries onto an external SSD, and I think especially now that this is a Thunderbolt 5 device, and I think in the next year you'll see Thunderbolt 5 SSDs reaching speeds of 3, 4, 5, 6,000 megabytes a second, because the bandwidth is really going to be a lot more. It really won't have a big advantage over the internal SSD, which has been at 6,000 or 7,000 megabytes a second for a while. Now, one thing I'll mention is I really don't need this. The M3 Max is incredible. It's fast. I really haven't seen any problems with it at all. If you have an M1 MacBook Pro or you're on an Intel MacBook Pro, this is definitely a huge upgrade. If you have the M2, a little bit more. If you have an M3, if you've got an M3 and you want to go to an M4 Max, that's a pretty big step. But if you've got the M3 Max, then you probably don't need to upgrade. And pop it open. That's kind of a satisfying sound. I really, like I said the last time, this is kind of cool how they do the box. This is pretty much identical to last year. I don't think there's any changes. And of course, I did buy the space black one. I didn't bother setting it up in my other location because, like I said, it's just really kind of more of an informal box opening. Because it's identical, the only way I can tell the difference is by looking at the specs. It's got the same black cord. I assume it still has a white power supply, and it does. One of these days, they're going to give me a black power supply to go with it. Anyway, let's just take a quick look. And I'm anxious to put this to the test. I think the reason I want to upgrade every year is I've done so many different versions of the MacBook and the Mac Pro that, yep, pretty much looks exactly the same. I've done so many tests, the same test for, like 10 generations now, and I just really want to be able to continue to do that. And I just really want to see where do we go with Lightroom and Photoshop with this machine. Is it noticeable? And also some video tests, and I'll probably do a couple of other tests. Anyway, I'll play with it for a few days, and I'll finish this video up with the test results. See you soon. Well, I've had my new MacBook Pro 3 weeks now, and let's just start right off by comparing the last 4 generations. And you'll notice that from a performance standpoint, we really don't seem to see a lot of progress here. In fact, the export tests for modified files took slightly longer. Now, I have a theory about that, which is not related to the chip performance, but something else. We'll get to that when we get to that test. But the one thing I will say, if you're considering upgrading the new MacBook Pro, it's probably not going to be about performance. There are several other features, and we'll cover those at the end of the video, why you might consider it anyway. But as far as real performance gains over the M3 Max, we're not really seeing it, except a little bit in Photoshop. Now, that's a little bit deceptive because with Photoshop, it's waiting for you most of the time. And unless you're running really high-end actions, extensive actions that take minutes to complete, Photoshop is you deciding to do a filter, and then it takes 2 seconds to do the filter. Then you deciding to do another filter, and it takes 3 seconds to do the filter. Well, going from 2 to 1.8 and 3 to 2.8, you're not going to see that at all. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about why I don't think we're seeing as much of a performance gain. Here are the 5 machines that I'm going to list in the test. I've done about 15 Macs over the years, but we're going to compare the last 5 MacBook Pros that Apple's made, going back to the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro, the Intel one. And you'll notice that the 2023 and the 2024, they have the same basic configuration. They're both 16-core machine with 4 efficiency cores and 12 performance cores. They have 40-core GPUs. They have 64 gigabytes of unified memory. To me, that means there isn't a lot of extra processing horsepower in there. Now, Lightroom doesn't really leverage those performance cores very well, nor does Photoshop. And so sometimes maybe the software will improve, and that maybe is why Photoshop's improving a little bit. But I think this is one of the reasons that we're not seeing a big gain. As I mentioned, there are several other features of the computer that might make it compelling to upgrade, but performance is probably not one of those. Well, let's go ahead and get into the individual tests real quick. So test one, we're just going to import the same 500 Sony A7R4 files we use in all the other tests. The previews are set to be sidecar and embedded. This is just the fastest way to import them. This is really exactly the same thing as just doing a Finder copy over to your computer, except Lightroom knows about it. They're on an external SSD, which is pretty fast. And because of that, you can see that the speed gains haven't been significant over the years. In fact, the last three have taken exactly the same amount of time. I think that's because now we're basically limited by how fast you can get the files into the computer. If you are importing from an SD card, you won't see anywhere near this kind of performance because you just can't read an SD card that fast. But that means now we're pretty well at the limit of whatever the source files are, and there's really not a lot that can be done in software to speed this up. It's really fast anyway. 500 files in 30 seconds, that's pretty fast. Okay, on test two, we have to make one-to-one previews of all those files. This is pushing the processor a little bit. It's not as limited by disk access. Get that out of my mouth. And over the last several generations, we've made considerable and consistent progress. But going to the M4 Max, we see just a slight amount of improvement over the M3 Max. Not real significant. I think 20 seconds in a 3-minute process. That's maybe 8%. I'm not sure of the number. And I think that's probably due to the fact that we're using the same number of cores and really the chip is configured similarly. I think Lightroom isn't really leveraging those cores very well. I don't know if there's any way that that can be improved in the coding or if it's just kind of the limit of how everything works, because it obviously has to create a preview, then it's got to write it to file. And so it's maybe just not a real straight process. I don't know. On test three, we're going to export those files. We didn't modify them. We're simply going to make a 4,000 pixel long file, so we have to resize them and then set them to a JPEG 60, so we're going to compress them. And of course, the jump from the Intel MacBook Pro to the M series was pretty significant, and we've made some progress. We can see that it's half the time of the M3 over the M1, but in the case of the M4 to the M3, it's pretty well insignificant change, a few seconds. This might be in part due to the fact that the SSD is slower. We're going to talk about that here when we get to test 4. So in test 4, we're going to export all of those files again, but this time we've gone into the develop module and made a bunch of changes. I think there's 10 or 12 dust spots, some graduated filters, a bunch of global changes. Then we sync those to all the files so that they all have the same changes made to them. So Lightroom has to render those before it can export them. It takes a lot longer than just the straight export of the non-modified files. Again, you can see the step from the Intel to the current M series was gigantic, but the step from then has been fairly incremental, and in the case of the M4, it's slightly slower. I think this is due to the fact that I opted for a 2 terabyte SSD instead of a 4 terabyte SSD. I know Apple puts up to 4 SSD chips on the motherboard, and I think in the case of a 2 terabyte SSD, my guess is there's 2 chips. And in the case of the 4, they have all 4. Those are striped in array 0, and that's going to give you better performance. I just ran a Blackmagic disk speed test, not the best speed test, but pretty useful. And you can see on the M3 Max, I was able to get 7,000 megabytes a second write speed and around 5,800 read speed. Whereas on my new M4, because it's a 2 terabyte model, I can only get about 6,500 megabytes a second write speed and about 5,400 megabytes a second read speed. So I lost about, I don't know, around 8 to 10% of my disk speed. And of course, these 2 export tests are writing a lot of files to disk. And I think that's definitely going to impact their performance a little bit. So maybe not a true apples to apples comparison because I opted to buy the 2 terabyte model. Hard to really say unless I could get a hold of a 4 terabyte model to test. But I do think it shows we're really not gaining much in processing power with the M4 Max as far as Lightroom is concerned. Okay, so test 5, we're going to create 5 panoramas. There's about 30 to 40 IQ 180 files from my phase 1 back. These are taken years ago with an 80 megapixel back. And there's about 6 to 12 shots in each of those panos. And compared to the Intel MacBook Pro, we've made a big jump, but generationally, we're not seeing much change. I don't know if this is because it's as efficient as it can get and there's really nothing Adobe can do, but each generation only saves 7 to 10 seconds. That's in creating 5 panos, so that's like 1 second or 2 seconds per panel. So you're not going to see any really significant increase in performance if you're creating a lot of panels. Even if you're doing one at a time, there's virtually no speed increase. And maybe that's just as efficient as the code can be. I don't know. Now with Puget Bench, which is the test I use for Photoshop. It's a company in Seattle area that makes high-end Intel workstations specifically for Photoshop. This is a benchmark they created. It actually runs 21 actions, including making a pano and a whole bunch of other things, and then it repeats it 3 times. And what I do is I just see how long does it take to run this entire benchmark. I was surprised to see that there isn't a lot of improvement from the Intel MacBook Pro to the M1. I think at the time the M1 was running Photoshop in emulation mode, and by the time we got to the M2, Adobe had created the M1 code. And you'll notice this time we actually see a bigger improvement from the M3 to the M4 than we did the M2 to the M3. I'm not sure why this is. I don't know if Photoshop is getting better at the code. This time I ran it on Photoshop 2025, and it could be that there's just, they're improving the code a little bit. But it could be unrelated to that. It could just be that the processor handles this kind of stuff better. This is a fairly significant improvement, but as I mentioned earlier, most of the time Photoshop's waiting for you. So unless you're really doing a lot of heavy-duty actions or some pretty complicated stuff, for example, I've got an action that takes about 18 to 20 seconds to run, but I'll a lot of times batch mode it on 50 or 100 files. So that might be significant. I'm guessing that probably would be shorter. I might actually try that real quick with my M3 to my M4 just to see what it does. But anyway, not huge improvements, but more significant than in Lightroom. So Puget Bench gives me these benchmarks, and one reason I used version 8 beta is just because it's consistent all the way back when I started doing these tests around 2018. But anyway, one thing that's interesting is the GPU score is significantly better over the M3, and I don't understand why, because it uses the same number of GPUs, but it could be those GPUs are more useful. And of course, the GPU is more important when it comes to things like AI. That's what they're trying to get into, is on-machine AI, and those kind of processes. They found the GPUs are more critical because they'll work in parallel better than the CPUs do. That's why NVIDIA is doing so well, because their GPUs are powering a lot of these AI servers that are being built. In the general score, there's still a nice improvement, not as significant as the GPU. The filter score, again, a better improvement over the M3. And the photo merge score, this one puzzles me because it's significantly better. So I don't know if Photoshop finally put in some merge code. Lightroom's been good at it for a while, and now suddenly Adobe's getting better at it. But this means that it was merging, one of the tests was merging considerably better than it has in previous tests in my other computers. Here I listed the individual tests of all the M series compared, and you can see from the M1 to the M4, big gain. If you're considering an upgrade and you're on M2, M2 Max, and the others, this will give you an idea. I think anything M2 or older, pretty big gains in Photoshop. You're going to see some speed improvements that might even be noticeable a lot of the time, especially in certain things like content aware fill. Look at the difference there. It's pretty big. Here's a few of the other tests that they ran, and you'll notice that the magic wand tool was really poor in the original M1 Max, and now it's significantly better. Each test are incrementally about the same improvement over the M2 to M3. So Photoshop, there was more improvements than there were in Lightroom, but as I mentioned, unless you're doing some serious actions or things like that, you might not actually notice it at all. Now, starting about, 3 or 4 years ago, I actually started running a ScreenFlow test. This is compressing a 30-minute video, and I didn't have that available when I did my original 2016 MacBook Pro or 2019 MacBook Pro. So I've thrown the 2019 Mac Pro in there instead. And in this case, we're seeing a little bit of a gain, not quite as incremental as the past generations, about a 12 to 13% improvement in speed. And I think the same thing is going to apply for using things like Adobe Premiere, Final Cut Pro, some of those types of programs. So there are some nice gains, but overall, we're not seeing enough performance gains to really probably justify upgrades from anything M3 or on. So just for fun, I do a graph that shows how long it took for all of these tests to run. Again, you can see how significant the 2016 or 2019 inch Intel MacBook Pro, the improvements we've made there. Again, here you can see that over the last one, the M3 Max, only about a 12% gain and improvement in the overall time. So I wasn't super impressed with the speed, and in my case, probably wasn't the wisest thing to upgrade, but I do it simply because I like making these tests, and I'll probably be a sucker and keep doing it. So aside from the performance gains, which seem to be somewhat limited, there are several other new features of the MacBook Pro that might be appealing to some people. The first I'll mention is the display options. This is the first time I believe you've been able to get the nano textured display glass on a MacBook Pro. And from what I've heard, a lot of people say it's really awesome. In the old days, they did a matte screen, and of course that just killed contrast. If you're in a bright environment, this could be pretty big. Now, I don't order it because I'm really never not in a controlled environment. I don't use my MacBook Pro outside. I don't use it in bright locations. Whenever I travel with it, I'm usually in a hotel room, which I have kind of control. But if you're in bright locations or have a lot of reflections around, this might be useful. A lot of people really swear by it. Marquez Brownlee, for example, really talks about how great this nano texture is. Going along with that, this display, if it's in a bright environment, will actually reach 1,000 nits in the SDR mode. Now, you can't set it that. When you set it to full brightness, it'll limit it to 600, which is what the Mac M3s had. But if it detects a bright environment, apparently it will boost itself up to as much as 1,000 nits. So if you're using one of these outside between the nano textured glass and the increase in brightness, it might be a real factor. Now, one other thing that's interesting about the display, and it's not being talked about, but I stumbled on this, but apparently some of the displays, and maybe eventually all of them, or all of them now, I don't know, Apple is using quantum dot technology, which is really quite a bit of an improvement. Been used in TVs and other things for a long time. And apparently they finally found a way to make this quantum dot technology without the use of cadmium. And that's been kind of a stickler for Apple, not wanting cadmium in kind of their green policy and toxic chemical policy. I don't know a whole lot about it. I will put a link below where this is discussed and been discovered by a couple people, including some tests which show that the screen apparently gives a cleaner refresh rates and cleaner display. It would be interesting to see this side by side, but this is something that's not being talked about, but it is in at least some and maybe all of the new M4 MacBook Pros. It says the GPU offers second generation ray tracing, which will give you smoother graphics. And I think that the GPUs are similar, but I think possibly they actually have they're better optimized than the previous chip. The neural engine, I think, is more optimized for Apple Intelligence. They really talk a lot about that. A lot of people think that's overhyped, and it probably is, other than the fact that I think it's going to get really much better over time. I'm seeing features as I beta test the iOS 18.2 on my iPhone where some of the new Apple Intelligence features are actually looking pretty good. Some I think are just fluff. But that's kind of what everybody's doing. You know, the FaceTime camera, it now supports what's called center stage. Probably not a big deal to most people, but basically it sort of follows you, I guess. And it can even give you a desktop view if you're doing a conference call and you need somebody to see what's down on some document on your desk. So other than that, I think the feature that I'm looking forward to testing is the addition of Thunderbolt 5. A lot of people I don't think understand that Thunderbolt 4 is not as great as it sounds. 40 gigabits per second of bandwidth sounds like a lot until you realize that a 4K display takes up 16 gigabits per second of that. If you have two of those, that's 32 out of the 40. Good example is I have an SSD that I've tested. I can get 3,500 megabytes per second read and write if I've got that plugged directly into my Mac. If I plug that into a Thunderbolt 4 dock, which doesn't have much else plugged into it, maybe a couple of USB devices, that's going to drop to about 2,800 megabytes a second read and write. I'm not sure why the loss, but there's a pretty big, it's 10%. If I connect my 4K display and my 2K display to that dock, I can now only get about 1,800 megabytes per second write, and I think around 2,800 megabytes a second read. I lose almost 50% of my write speed because that 40 gigabits per second just can't handle all the bandwidth it takes for the displays as well as the SSD. If we double the bandwidth to 80 megabits or 80 gigabits per second, and we even add what's called asynchronous mode, which can boost it to 120 in one direction, which might be useful when you're writing data to files. There might be a significant improvement in the ability to create docks that really can handle one connection to your computer and anything you want. Right now, I always plug my SSD directly in my computer, even though I've got a port right in the front of my dock, because I just lose the speed. Now, maybe I don't need the speed, but there might be times I do. If I'm going to transfer a 10 gigabyte file or something like that, I want all the speed I can get. So I think Thunderbolt 5, as it comes online and as it starts to show up in more devices, there's already a Thunderbolt 5 dock from Kensington, which is compatible with the Mac. They've got 2 Thunderbolt 5 docks. I tested one, and it's not compatible. It works, but you lose too much speed. But they have the new one, and I've got it on order. OWC has already come out with a Thunderbolt 5 hub, which means I could connect 2 displays as well as my SSD and maybe not lose any speed. It'll be interesting. I've got that coming as well. Anyway, that can be compelling for, I think, a limited number of people. A lot of people don't really need it. In my case, I use my laptop as a desktop machine most of the time. So I really want that hub and that dock that's connected to be as efficient, as fast as possible. So Thunderbolt 5 for me might be a big deal. It just might be, fluff. I don't know. But I'm looking forward to testing some stuff. Anyway, that's the bottom line. I think for most people, if you're on an M3, you probably don't need to upgrade. I think going from an M2, any of the M2s, especially if the M2 or the M2 Pro, it's a pretty big jump. I don't think from the M3, M3 Pro, M3 Max, it's going to be significant. Definitely an M3 Max, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I don't think I really needed this. I don't think it offers enough to really make me want to upgrade, other than the fact I just like having the latest and the greatest to see how well it does. Hope you found the video useful. Any questions, just drop them down below. I'll be looking forward to testing the Thunderbolt 5 devices as they come out. Got a video right now comparing 3 different external SSD cabinets that are Thunderbolt 3 or USB 4. And I have found one that actually gives me that 3,500 megabits a second or megabytes a second speed, which really surprised me because most of the time you top out at 2,800 to 3,000. I'll have a video on that pretty soon, and it'll be interesting to see where we go with Thunderbolt 5 devices, because the SSDs are now much faster than Thunderbolt 4 can work. As the internal SSD, you can see, is giving me 6,000, 7,000 megabytes a second. And we might be able to get to a case where an external SSD will offer that same kind of speed. Anyway, hey, make sure you like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See ya.